Great, hello. I'm back. Did you miss me? No? Well, I'm here anyway. If I sound sick, that's because I am. I didn't make a video concerning the preview patch notes for this patch, because those never garnered much interest, so I thought let's just wait till the real patch notes drop, and they're here now. So let's talk about them. Here's the mandatory disclaimer. Don't skip the mandatory disclaimer. I will not be taking any questions regarding PvP. Moving on. Up front, some thoughts on the patch. I think it's pretty decent. I'm just glad it's not another huge rework patch. There's a lot of smaller changes here. There's a lot of groundwork being laid for builds they want you to use with the new weapons that are also out in the beta now. But there's no, sweeping reworks of fundamental game mechanics or anything, which is good. We've had several huge patches over the past half year or so a smaller one is appreciated. Though, one thing I'm really not happy with is that we seem to be back on the just buff everything train. I was kind of hoping we'd use the momentum from at least the last patch, that we'd start seeing more nerfs in the future rather than just buffing the alternatives, so we can curb the rampant power creep and not extend it further. But hey, every time anything gets nerfed, the community throws a giant tantrum. So hey, what can you do? First off, looking at general, we have some changes to the relics, including the single best change that the system could have gotten, and that is that relics are getting skill facts. Seriously, why was this not on release? This is the single thing I complain about by far the most. If you go back to the first impressions tier list I made for relics, there was an entire tier dedicated to the relics that just don't tell you what they do, because they don't give you the relevant numbers, or there's one that I think even just says applies conditions, and it's you might as well put does something in the text box there for all the information you're getting out of that, right? But now, we're getting the skill facts on them, you hover over them, you get all the information of exactly what the relic does. This should have been here from the start. But better slightly late than never. I'm just happy we've got it. Best change they could have made. Now we just need to address the other problem with relics, and that's the pricing. Basically, all the relics have nearly fixed prices at around 9 to 10 gold, and that's because the only way you can get the relics is either buying them from vendors, from a competitive reward track, or from the boxes that everybody got on solo launch. And so the supply is perpetually stagnant. People only really buy the relics they need from the vendors, and don't necessarily introduce more supply into the economy. Especially, they will never buy the relics that aren't meta relevant because there's no demand for them. So the supply is hardly ever going to grow, which means that the pricing will stay either stagnant or will increase. Which not only means relics as a fundamental build component will always be expensive, 10 gold for the additional on-top cost that you didn't have pre-Soto is a lot, and there is never going to be budget options because, well, there is no options with excess supply that could become budget options. And I think that really sucks, especially when one of the things that relics are designed to do is allow you to swap your quote-unquote T6 bonus more often for the purposes of utility and experimentation and niche application. But that doesn't work if nobody wants to invest in these for not only taking up a whole bunch of inventory space, but also just being too expensive. It's just never worth it to invest in a variety of relics to play with. You get the ones from the achievements, you get the ones from the boxes, and then you just buy the ones you need for the meta, and that's it. That's the extent of experimentation. So really, these need to be somewhere else in the economy for them to fully work. Also, you should probably get at least one of them, or a choice of them, when you hit 80. Just a thought. I think that should be a thing. Legendary relics obviously solve the experimentation problem, but the existence of a legendary shouldn't excuse the otherwise poor accessibility of relics. So yeah, they could have put them on the champions in convergences, so that all the champions have a reasonable chance to just drop a chest with a choice of relics that are not account bound, which would have been great for convergences as a content form in the long term to be relevant even to people who aren't farming the legendaries, and give those a unique place in the game, but hey, who's thinking about long-term design at this point? Anyway, that was my relic rant. Let's move on to the actual balance things. So we're staying on topic with the relics because there's a bunch of them that are getting changed. And it's mostly the support relics, which are the ones that have the most potential to have some variance and to just actually get people to swap between multiple ones, which means it's actually worth to consider the balance between multiple ones, because for the DPS relics, you just pick whichever is mathematically the best and run with it. But most of these changes are only going to be relevant in the competitive modes. There's a couple here that are interesting and worth talking about, namely the Herald relic is now actually useful. They removed the internal cooldown from gaining stacks of the relic, which means that now just 2 boon applications to 5 people fully stacks up the relic, which essentially means you always get the full concentration at pretty much all times, which is how the relic should have worked from the start. Because before this, it was just too inconsistent and too slow to be useful. Because, you know, you want your full duration at the start of the fight, not like 10-20 seconds into the fight. That's terrible. Now it's potentially actually worth considering on builds that need high amounts of boon duration, except that there is currently basically no build worth playing that requires high amounts of boon duration, because they've increased the base duration of boons so much that most things barely build any. Oh well, it's a nice thought, I guess. Monk runes also get the same treatment, which is nice for consistency, but I don't know if this was a good decision, because right now we actually have a nice mix of different support relics on different healers, depending on how well they can actually use the varying relics, including Monk, which is definitely harder to use for some with the internal cooldown. There is classes like Herald and Druid that pulls a lot of small packets of boons that can trigger it very easily, but there's other ones like Mechanist that don't do that so well. So now things like Flock and Duena and one of the new relics that was also a healing relic are far less appealing just because Monk is now good on everything again. But hey, maybe those can still pull their weight, we'll have to see. The Payfire relic has also been slightly reworked. The flat damage increase is now just a regular buff, and the Torment has also been buffed. This relic is too specific to see much use because it triggers on Shadow Stepping, which is pretty much exclusive to Mesmer and Thief, and with the Torment duration getting significantly buffed, this will be super interesting for Mirage specifically, because Mirage has a lot of Shadow Stepping in its rotation. Not so much, I don't think, for something like Spectre, which is, you know, the closest Thief equivalent, but on the whole, it still has to compare to Fractal, so I don't know if anything is going to come of this. And the last one that's worth calling out is Ice, which now procs 3 different instances of Chill, which makes it hilarious on specifically Condi Reaper. That is all I have to say about that one. While we're at it, I might as well talk about the new relics that get added with the previous patch. The effects are on screen now. For a quick judgment, Naios, Phoebe, and the Demon Queen are basically completely PvP focused. There's really nothing worth doing with them in PvE. Though, I will have to say, the Demon Queen sounds nuts in PvP. I don't know much about PvP, but 50% healing reduction sounds kind of crazy. Which leaves us with 3 that are worth talking about. 1, Norius, which is also a PvP relic, but I just wanted to talk about because I love seeing the old Signet of the Wild effect again. I really miss that skill. In theory, the massive 25% boost could be used to line up with a burst window on specific builds to create some insane burst damage, but that's wildly inconsistent and gimmicky. It does proc on its own, even if you don't strip boons, but only every 30 seconds, which puts the average damage boost of it below every other option. In theory, it's a really funny swap for something like a Spellbreaker if you're running like Fractals and get one of the instabilities that puts a bunch of boons on enemies. So keep that in mind, that would be very funny if nothing else. But yeah, it's a gimmick. Caracoso is another decent healing relic, It actually straight up sees use right now on specifically Tempest, because Tempest has a really easy time loading up on a bunch of blast finishers, as well as water fields to begin with, so they love this stuff. Though now it has to compete with Unkept Monk again, so And then the Midnight King, in theory, could be useful on some healers to stack up Might or produce Fury more quickly and consistently, but the good ones don't need help doing that, and the stack count is too low on the Might to matter for DPS supports, because there is no way this ever does Might by itself, and I don't think they want this doing Might by itself, and there isn't really a support that just does some Might stacks, and most of the time, you know, every healer at this point does Might, so whatever, right? That's plenty for the general, or specifically the relic changes, so let's talk about the rest of the game, starting with Elementalist. Hammer is getting a whole long list of buffs, including cooldown reduction, damage increases, and buffs to the passives of the Hammer 3, as well as making some skills easier to hit, which that last part should really help against moving targets in some situations. This is really nice because currently Sword Warhorn is kind of the only thing worth playing unless you're like exactly Condi Weaver, which still prefers Scepter, but almost everything else runs Sword Warhorn. Hammer's generally not super far behind those two, so this will help those be more competitive with each other. Personally, I kind of, again, rather see some nerfs at this point, rather than just handing out more buffs, but what are you going to do? There's also some minor buffs for specifically the water skills on Warhorn, which is nice for support Tempest exactly. Nice, I guess. This doesn't do a whole lot. And then Tornado is getting a cooldown reduction, which is incredibly funny to me because that skill needs to be reworked if it's ever supposed to be good, but it is very, very funny. Other things include Weaver's healing getting buffed. I'm guessing this is a PvP change they just don't feel like splitting. And then a change I actually really quite like, which is Catalyst's DPS capstone, Empowered Empowerment, is getting changed. It's not getting buffed in and of itself, but rather they're changing the functionality, so instead of getting nothing if you're not at max stacks, you get half the buff you would normally get. This doesn't actually increase the DPS ceiling, but rather helps Catalyst's really high skill floor drop down a bit to a more manageable level, which means that this massive skill gap between good Catalyst players and bad Catalyst players gets a little smaller. It's not gone, but it's a little bit smaller, which makes the whole thing more consistent and easier to balance, so that's nice, because Ellie is always a balance nightmare. Moving on to Engineer, power weapons are getting buffed across the board. This is because Hammer is currently the only power weapon worth using, so Rifle is getting some love, including Netshot being reworked again. I swear they don't know what to do with this skill. At one point they removed the damage completely from it. Now it has a scaling modifier of over 1.0. I don't know. Though I like them working with the casting times here, making the whole thing feel a lot smoother to use, rather than just upping some damage numbers. Offhand Pistol is also getting rework and becoming a proper power weapon, with both its skills having massively increased power coefficients. So now you finally actually have something to pair with Sword that is meaningful. Which, yes, explains why Sword isn't getting any buffs. These are the Sword buffs. Medkit 2 is also getting some nice quality of life, making that a much more consistent and reliable heal. People keep complaining about Mechanist's burst healing. This helps. And now we get to the really interesting part, and that's Scrapper. Scrapper is getting a small number of changes, but all of them are quite impactful. First off, several of its traits are getting reworked or retooled to be proper healing support traits. System Shocker now applies to allies, Mass Momentum now also grants stability to reliably to 5 targets, and Expert Examination has been completely reworked to now give protection. This is really nice because Heal Scrapper has been struggling to be irrelevant at all, especially compared to Mechanist, and part of that is that it just doesn't actually add much to a healing build beyond Function Gyro and the ability to do quickness. which really isn't enough. So this makes the whole thing a lot more coherent. And the reason we're adding protection here, when we already have a very reliable protection source from shield and its trait, is because they want you to use this with the new upcoming short bow, which is a support weapon that doesn't do protection but offers you other things. But unfortunately, in its current state, ANET kind of missed something here, which is where Scrapper still needs to do combo finishers to do boons. And Shortbow has exactly one blast finisher on it. That is not enough. So unfortunately, Shortbow kinda sucks right now, unless they introduce more combo finishers to it. They have time to fix it, otherwise, yeah, you're still sticking with Mace and Shield, which makes the protection trait redundant. Anyway, moving on. We're not quite done with Scrapper yet, because we're also getting some changes that matter more to DPS versions of Scrapper, namely Blast Gyro is getting its cooldown reduced, and its damage reduced to compensate, because that's not where the damage is supposed to be coming from. The point of this is that this replaces Throw Mine as the blast finisher with the shortest cooldown. They now have the same cooldown, which is really, really nice for specifically Quickness Scrapper, because Throw Mine sucks. It is so annoying to play with because of the aftercast, so having a skill that's easier to use than that is really, really nice, though I think currently use both on the same build, so this also doesn't do much. They are still buffing Scrapper damage, and they're doing it this time by giving you even more power with every stack of might from Applied Force. Yay. Moving on to Mechanist, and another thing that they don't really know what to do with, and that's Mechanical Genius. The penalty you get when your mech is too far away from you, which now they're introducing a grace timer, so that when your mech runs away from you, all of a sudden, it doesn't immediately drop its stats. Instead, it keeps the effect that gives it the full stats for a little bit before that runs out, and if it's still too far away from you, then it gets the penalty. This is actually quite nice. This is a band-aid fix for the weird pet AI, which is better on the mech, but still suffers from it, where the pets sometimes just zoom off in a random direction, and this prevents it from suddenly dropping stats for positioning weirdly for a little bit, or like chasing a target when it moved away fast. They're also changing how relics apply to the mech, with now some of them applying to just the mech, and some of them applying to both of you and the mech, and I don't really get it. I don't think this is going to have much of an impact in PvE, I don't think. But it is weird, and I don't think this is a good idea because it will just cause a whole lot of confusion. There's also some Holosmith changes. These do basically nothing. Moving on to Guardian. And Guardian is getting something very, very fun, and that's hammer buffs. Basically, every single number that could be on hammer is somehow getting better. We have changes to the casting times, we have buffs in the damage, we have more barrier randomly, which sure, and also a target cap increase. All of these are nice. This is going to make hammer feel a lot more fun to play. I don't know if it's enough to make hammer DPS viable, but hammer was already a really cute and fun weapon to play in open world, so this just makes it better. Offhand Sword is also getting some similar increases, with some damage buffs and some increases in their hit size, so that it will be easier to confirm these skills, which, sure, I guess. Sword was kind of dead on arrival at just being a worse power weapon than Focus, especially when the two-handed weapons are so good. It's probably the least interesting and least impactful weapon they have added ever, so I'd personally rather see a full rework of this weapon to give it a stronger identity, rather than just being the second power offhand that's not interesting or good. But, you know, I'll take damage buffs. Dragon Hunter is getting what I can only describe as quality of life changes, getting some of the defensive skills buffed. I guess this is nice. I always thought Dragon Hunter felt a bit weirdly fragile, but I think for the most part this is just PvP changes that they didn't feel like splitting. And then traps now give Aegis instead of applying slow, which is probably too unreliable to be particularly useful, especially when Advance exists. Again, PvP change that just happens to come to us as well. Firebrand is getting a minor change in that it's F1. The skill 5 now applies more might, which makes Firebrand's might generation a lot more consistent. This is nice. Firebrand is one of the few, prime healers that can struggle with might uptime a little bit, and is kind of the only reason that people care about Alacrity supports doing might. So, yeah. That, and I honorary mention to Scrapper, who just can't do might. Poor yo Scrapper, they got it rough, man. Willbender is getting a combination of these two types of changes. For one, they get Vitality instead of Healing Power from their passives now, which just makes way more sense. And then a couple of their exclusive skills also have had their damage buffed, which I'm glad they're going through the exclusive skills, they're going through the utility skills, because anything to differentiate Dragon Hunter and Willbender is deeply appreciated. And now one of their traits actually now shares might instead of applying might to yourself, which is cute, I guess, for the 5 people that play Alacrity Willbender, which, yeah, I don't know. Based on the partners that you have, might on Alacrity supports is really not that important anymore. So really, nothing huge for Guardian, but those hammer changes are really nice. Moving on to Mesmer. And it's Condi buffs across the board, and I don't really understand why. Both Condi Virtuoso and Condi Mirage are doing totally fine. They don't need any buffs. And a lot of the things that have been buffed here are already being used. I get some of these. So Axe is getting changed so that the clones no longer perform the auto attack chain, but instead just use the standard auto, which in turn has been buffed for the clones specifically. This makes specifically Mirage a lot more consistent and eliminates one of the longest standing weird mechanics that you had to learn when playing Mirage, which is to let the clones finish their auto attack chain. This makes Mirage a lot easier to play, which is nice, even though that skill expression was always kind of cool to have, but oh well, whatever. And then Scepter gets a whole bunch of buffs, including a rework to its traits, which is really nice because Scepter is basically a dead weapon. There is almost never a reason to use it, especially after the changes on how confusion damage is calculated. It made the one niche that Scepter had, which was proccing a shit ton of confusion to do more damage to foes vulnerable to confusion, basically killed that and made Scepter a worthless weapon. Now it's getting some buffs and might potentially be useful because it's also leaning a little bit more into Torment, which is the better condition. But then we are also getting buffs to Staff, Torch, and the rest of the illusion trait line. The only other one that has a sensible explanation here is Torch, which was one of the few things that still had a cooldown trait that they just kind of forgot about. A similar thing for the Axe, actually, which they are now getting rid of, and so they're compensating with other effects. But at the same time, we're just adding more damage to the Torch trait, Staff, and the Illusions passives, and I don't know why. There is no reason to warrant this. All of these things already see consistent use on builds that are not struggling. I don't know what is happening here. The other, and frankly probably more interesting part of this, is the rework to the support traits, mainly in the Inspiration trait line, where basically the entire trait line is getting reworked and you're now getting reliable, actual support for healing builds, as well as access to stability and protection, which are things that Mesmer has completely lacked until now. Not the stability so much, but the other things, which is absolutely preparation for Heal Chrono, with the upcoming rifle that is now in the beta, which, I more or less predicted would be a healing weapon, and here's the healing traits to go along with it, because without that, Healing Chrono would have been merely a gimmick. So these are really nice to see. We'll have to see in-game how these play out. If you want to try something for the beta, this would be something cool and fun to try out. Moving on to Necro, and there is nothing particularly relevant happening here. A lot of these are, again, a theme that we've been having, PvP changes that just don't have a reason not to be in PvE, so we're getting them as well. Mostly dealing with increased sustained defense options for Necro, which is something they already weren't struggling with. There's some cute things in here for open world. like being able to use Lingering Curse and Parasitic Contagion on the same build, but yeah, that's about it. I do want to call out the buff to Deadly Strength, which now also gives condition damage instead of just power, which makes the Death Magic trait line far more cohesive to build around. It's still not gonna be any good, but it is cool to see for open world to add more cohesion to a trait line that is just a bit of a mess. And then we go on to Ranger, which has the longest section and possibly one of the longest patch note sections for any class ever since, like, the time they reworked what trait lines are. I call this the Great Pet Restattening, and here are large buffs for pretty much all pets, almost all of them, making them more useful and more cohesive across the board, and also more consistent, which is really important, because that's one of the biggest problems with Ranger pets. They just don't really do what they're supposed to be doing, ever. It's basically impossible for me to predict the impact of this. All non-soul beasts should now see a small passive increase in damage, that's one thing, but I'm crossing my fingers that this really does help to increase pet variety. I think it's also supposed to prepare us a little bit for the maces that are upcoming, which are kind of playing with the pet a little bit. Not really, but they do kind of interact with the pet, or they're at least themed around interacting with the pet. So yeah, that's what this is for. Crossing my fingers for pet variety, but I wouldn't hold my breath, I'll be honest. I'm absolutely not going to go through these one by one. I think the one that's possibly the most interesting to look at is the Bristleback, because that was always kind of at the edge of being really good, and now it might just be really good. But there's so many changes to parse through that, honestly, this is probably better to just try out rather than try to read it all in one go. And then we go to Revenant, where it finally happened. Hammer is getting buffed. Oh my god. This took so long. Why did this take so long? Why was Revenant never allowed to have a good ranged weapon? Well, the curse is finally broken. Hammer is getting buffed. I wish they didn't just increase the damage, but also looked at the casting times, because Hammer always feels really awkward and slow, even with quickness. I know that this is probably a thing to maintain counterplay, specifically in World vs. World, where Hammer has always been really good. But, you know, after cast times could have been reduced a bit here and there. Just for me, as a favor, somebody who doesn't play Revenant, please. Anyway, there's also other stuff, namely that Shield is getting reworked, and Shield 5 is actually useful now. It pulses healing, which is the thing it should have been doing the entire time. A sentence I've said a surprising amount of times in this video. And also, Shield 4 just grants Aegis now, which is absolutely nuts. This is the one thing that Herald wasn't allowed to do, and I thought it was a balancing mechanism because of how good Herald is. Like that's kind of insane. Herald was already a contender for the best healer. It's now, at the very least, as good of Druid, as if not better. I don't particularly like playing Heal Herald, but I can completely recognize how insane it is. In other news, Shortbow also now pierces baseline, instead of requiring it from the Renegade trait line, which is nice for exactly Condi Herald, I guess. There's also a random DPS Herald buff, which... sure... I don't know why Herald needs to be the best healer, an insane DPS support, and also a good DPS, especially when it is a support-themed spec that doesn't add anything particularly interesting to the DPS gameplay, but, you know, who am I to judge? Go nuts. I'm sad it's on the least interesting part of the kit, which is, you know, the part that encourages you to just sit on channel scales forever. And then the T2 Vindicator traits are all getting completely reworked. Long story short, Energy Meld is now relevant. I have no idea what this change is. Vindicator continues to feel like a complete mess to me. Somebody who knows things about Vindicator, please explain what is happening. Thank you. Moving on. To Thief, which is getting some interesting things. So first off, Pistol is getting buffed, specifically Condi Pistol. This is a weird change now that we have Scepter on everyone. because the build that used pistol mainhand as a conduit weapon did exist, but was always more of a meme because it involves shadow stepping backwards all the time, which I guess combines nicely with the Payfa relic that just got buffed. I don't know. I think this is gonna be more a build that's funny rather than being particularly good, just because it's another forced movement thief build, and again, we have Scepter, which is really good and doesn't have that problem. And then Staff is also kind of getting reworked. First off, the probably funniest change, which is the third strike of the auto attack no longer reflects projectiles, which is so funny because there is such an annoying interaction on specifically bosses like Cairn, where you want to not reflect projectiles, and then the thief has to be careful with their auto attacks because they reflect projectiles and they couldn't do anything about it. It was so funny. I'm so glad it's gone because that was always really annoying. They're also changing some of the other skills to make them more relevant and more dynamic. The 3 now gains a flip over that after rolling out, you can jump back in and also do CC with it, which turns this from a PvP skill into a PvP skill that has a slight bit of utility on it. And the 4, which before was a kind of crappy blind, now applies AoE and also reflects projectiles, so you still have that utility, and again, remains like a PvP dueling skill, but that can be said about a lot of Thief skills. I think they are slowly realizing that Thief needs one good DPS skill and the rest should be utility focused, and these are nice. These don't change anything, but these are nice. And last up we have Warrior, which has more very confusing changes. So first up, Mace is getting buffed in its damage and becoming a power weapon. Okay, so Mace is a weird weapon because Mace is meant to be was meant to be a utility weapon almost exclusively dedicated to CC. This has generally been actually useful on things like Berserker historically, which only really need axes to do their damage, and lose almost nothing from using their secondary set as a utility set with one of the most useful and universal forms of utility in card control. But I guess they want maces to do DPS now. I don't know. I don't know. Next up, Vengeance. The downstate 3 doesn't suck anymore. Now you are guaranteed to rally if you kill something during Vengeance, whereas before it was a 25% chance going up to 100 with a trait. This was always stupid. Now I don't know if this is like maybe nuts in PvP, but I honestly think that's pretty cool for them and makes Warrior like pretty unique there, but I'm probably talking out of my ass in that regard, so hey. But in general, Vengeance, at least in PvE, was just never ever worth using because it was a suicide button. You were always more likely to get rezzed than to do anything during Vengeance. The only reason to ever use Vengeance is when you are so close to dying that you know you're not going to get rezzed anymore, so you might as well get in the last few thousand DPS. That is the only reason to ever have used Vengeance, even in open world, where really, because you're fighting smaller mobs, you should be able to use Vengeance to res yourself, but because you don't rally, when you use Vengeance, you just have a 25% chance of rallying if you kill something, and it wasn't worth using the trait on because why would you waste a trait on helping you in a scenario that you're trying to prevent from happening in the first place? Like, again, this is how it should have always worked, is just a running theme. And while this change makes a lot of sense, we now move on to things that don't make any sense, which is more crit buffs to the arms trade line. Why? Last year, when they removed all the class buffs and increased the precision that is available in the game, or the flat crit buffs available for traits rather, they decided that arms was the trait line for it. Which makes sense insofar that arms does have a crit theme, but arms is a condi trait line. And they said they were gonna put the crit buffs in the power trait lines. And arms is probably the only trait line that has never been used on a relevant warrior power build. So why are we doubling down on the thing that doesn't make sense about arms when you already have 4 other good power trait lines that you want to be using instead, and that all have potential usage. Why are we trying to make the 5th one happen? It doesn't make any sense. Just why? There's also one more interesting DPS-orientated change, and that's a pseudo-rework to the heightened focus trait, which does conflict with Berserker's power, but now it recharges your burst skills when it activates, which is essentially every 12 seconds when the enemy is below half health, which over the course of the fight might as well read once every 24 seconds you get an additional burst over the course of a boss fight, which is in theory really interesting for weapons like Greatsword and Hammer, or in other words, stuff that isn't Axe, as well as Bladesworn, because this should reset the Dragon Trigger cooldown as well. I think. Maybe. So, like, potentially this has some use on either Spellbreaker or Bladesworn, but again, it's competing with Berserker's power, and that's a really hard sell. Moving on, we're not done with warrior changes because there is something else really nice, and that is we're getting changes to the tactics trait line, adding additional healing and reliable protection sources, which is something that warrior couldn't do before. They had a little bit of protection in there, but not enough to actually cover full uptime. This is preparation for staff healing warrior, obviously. I was kind of hoping they'd also add some more utility to the, utility skills, some additional ways to properly share other boons, at least some proper Aegis and stability would have been appropriate, but I take what we can get. I don't think that neither this nor the actual staff are going to be enough to make Heal Warrior genuinely meta on release, but this is a decent foundation to get there eventually. And then we have the Berserker changes, which are all quite nice. So first off, there are some changes to how Berserk uptime works. Basically, it has a longer base duration now and less of a cooldown, but the Smash Brawler trait no longer increases the duration of Berserk. Instead, you up the duration every time you use a Primal Burst skill, with the Axe one doing less. I think overall this should make it noticeably easier to maintain permanent Berserk, which has been a major frustration point with Berserker, and I think also, brings down the skill floor quite a bit to make it more accessible to various people, which is very ironic that Berserker, the HUD hit things hard spec, was kind of hard to approach in a way. Another really, really good change is Heat the Soul. The quickness applying trait no longer has an internal cooldown. It is finally playable. It actually works. Oh my god. Basically, for those unaware, Quickness Berserker has been pretty much unplayable, because to keep up quickness, you already needed a significant amount of boon duration, but then even with that high amount of boon duration, you still needed to hit your burst skills on an exact internal cooldown that didn't match your cooldowns, and if you ever missed, or went too fast or too slow, which was impossible to tell, you would be dropping uptime. And then if you ever got dropped out of Berserk, God forbid, which was already harder because you're not running the trait that extends Berserk, it basically became impossible. This fixes all of these problems. It finally works consistently. The reason this had an internal cooldown in the first place was the existence of Axe, because they didn't want you to just be able to spam Axe over and over and over again and maintain quickness that way without having to try even a little bit. The solution they have found is to just give Axe half the quickness duration, which I think is pretty fair. But now we're finally actually gonna see Quickness Berserker become a real thing. Now we just need to do the same thing for Alacrity Bladesworn. But this was really important because, Berserker is probably the version that the Healing Warrior is gonna end up being, and the quickness working is one of the things that it lives or dies on. I still consider it a massive flavor fail that Bladesworn and Berserker are the ones giving boons, not Spellbreaker, which is the one that has the most tactical elements. Oh well, what am I gonna do about it? Well, I'm gonna end the video, that's what I'm gonna do about it, because that's all the relevant changes. There's some other things I haven't mentioned, mostly some defensive and healing skills that are getting buffed. It feels like there is two themes with this patch, which is one, stuff that is meant for PvP but no reason to not put into PvE, so it's here now, and two, things that should have worked like that the entire time. Those are the two categories of changes we have right now, and I think they're generally pretty good. Again, I'm not totally happy with the buff everything mentality, but oh well, there are worse things. I'm gonna make a separate video or video series, I don't know how long those are gonna be yet, on the weapon beta that is out right now. That has too much to talk about for me to do it here. I'm gonna spend some time over the next couple days making screenshots of skill facts for that. And yeah, what I'm probably not gonna make a video on is the story analysis for the last patch, because A, those story videos just did extremely poorly for the amount of effort that went into them, and B, to put it bluntly, I think what we got in the last patch was the worst story we got since Champions. It's hard to go worse than Champions, but it was so frustrating and terribly written that I honestly just don't want to talk about it because it makes me too angry. So yeah, maybe I'll see you again when it's time to talk about the new weapons. Until then, goodbye.